By a stroke of luck, all three of the fleet's aircraft carriers were at sea, carrying Marine fighter planes to U.S. Pacific outposts. Nagumo's fleet reached its attack point on the evening of December 6, 1941, 275 miles north of Hawaii. The Japanese had a very clear idea of the layout of Pearl Harbor. The primary targets of the attack would be the airfields, the battleships, and the aircraft carriers, whose absence Japanese intelligence failed to detect. The attack would take place in two waves. The first had 180 aircraft, and the second, a short time later, had around 160. The remaining Japanese planes were to be held in reserve. At 6:15 on the morning of Sunday, December 7th, the first wave of Japanese aircraft took off, led by Commander Mitsuo Fushida. The first planes appeared over Pearl Harbor just before 8 a.m. Japan was about to follow a path from which there was no turning back. As Sunday, December 7th, 1941 dawned at Pearl Harbor, a surprise attack from the air was the last thing on anyone's mind. A U.S. radar operator picked up the incoming Japanese aircraft, but was told it was probably a group of American B-17s on their way to the base. The Japanese planes approached the fleet base from the north. Then the attack began. Within 30 minutes, the airfields were reduced to a tangled heap of smoldering wreckage. Worse, the gleaming pride of the U.S. Pacific Fleet, Battleship Row, was nothing but burning hulks. The Japanese attack was such a surprise that the U.S. failed to engage the Japanese planes. The second attack began at 8:40 a.m. By this time, the U.S. had recovered from the initial shock and fought back. But it was inadequate. The base suffered more damage and loss of life. Japanese airmen who had taken off less than 4 hours before were convinced they had achieved a knockout blow. It would take them months to realize they had, in fact, committed a terrible blunder. Back at Pearl Harbor, the devastation was total. "180 American aircraft had been destroyed. The base was virtually defenseless against further air attack. But even worse was the damage to the Pacific Fleet. Five battleships were totally destroyed, and the other 3 badly damaged. Altogether, 2,300 people died, including more than 1,100 on the battleship Arizona. The Japanese lost only 5 of their midget submarines, around 30 aircraft and about 100 men. The Japanese High Command considered it a small price to pay for disabling the entire battleship force of the U.S. Pacific Fleet. When news of the attack reached the U.S., the public was stunned. President Roosevelt addressed Congress.
December 7, 1941, a date which will live in infamy.
U.S. neutrality was swept aside. On December 8, 1941, the U.S. and Britain declared war on Japan. 3 days later, Germany and Italy declared war on the United States. The conflict had now become global. At last, Britain, standing alone, had an ally capable of defeating Nazi Germany. The attack on Pearl Harbor not only led to the defeat of Tokyo's European allies, it also had dire consequences for Japan itself. The attack on Pearl Harbor was one of the greatest blunders in the history of warfare. Anger over Japan's attack united the American public as never before. One member of the Japanese High Command remarked, "I fear we have awakened a sleeping giant." Yamamoto and his planners also committed serious tactical blunders. They failed to target Pearl Harbor's oil storage tanks. The loss of oil would have prevented the U.S. Pacific Fleet from going to sea for months. That would have given Japan a freer hand in the Pacific. Worse, in their belief that they had dealt the U.S. a grievous blow, the Japanese totally ignored the fact that the U.S. carriers were still at large. These ships would soon become the backbone of the new Pacific Fleet. As America mobilized for war, Japan's belief that the U.S. would allow them to consolidate their empire proved a fatal miscalculation. Japan continued to overrun such countries as the Philippines, Burma, and Malaya. For a while, Japan seemed unstoppable. Then, the U.S. carriers and escorts that survived Pearl Harbor were sent to the Southwest Pacific. On May 9, 1942, they clashed in the Coral Sea. A Japanese invasion force was en route to Papua New Guinea. After a fierce battle, the Japanese withdrew. They were thwarted for the first time. Undeterred, the Japanese turned east a month later. The target was the Pacific outpost of Midway. Japan first launched an airstrike against the island itself. But the U.S. carriers then struck back. They sank the 4 Japanese carriers present. It was a devastating setback. Yamamoto was shocked by this reversal of his country's fortunes and ordered the combined fleet to retreat immediately. He and the Japanese High Command finally began to realize how wrong they'd been about the American determination to fight. After Midway, the U.S. began island hopping in the Pacific. This brought U.S. forces ever closer to the Japanese mainland. In spite of mounting losses, Japan fought on for 3 more bloody years. During the last year of the conflict, U.S. heavy bombers brought the horrors of war to Japan itself. This culminated in the dropping of atom bombs over Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Faced with this awesome and destructive power, Japan had no choice but to surrender. Japan's military leaders had deluded themselves about their attack on Pearl Harbor, and thereby committed an ultimately fatal blunder.